learning outcomes are a broad spectrum of different things. They can be just knowledge, they can be knowledge and skills, they can be knowledge, skills and attitudes. And so Bloom and his work applies not only to learning things that are just knowledge, but also to a whole area of competencies. Competencies are an example of learning outcomes. The other thing we wanted to do was to simplify the terms. I'm a civil engineer, and I find words like cognitive, psychomotor, and affective don't immediately tell me what it's all about. And so we simplified. And if we simplified too far, I apologize, but I find it much easier. So you can see the renaming. And what we tried to do as well was to take account of the work that had been done in the interim and just make sure that things were as consistent and coherent as possible. This is the heart of it. We have the three domains: the knowledge domain, the skills domain, the attitudes domain. The first and lowest level of the Bloom's taxonomy, or the new Bloom's taxonomy, the S0 and the A0, those are actually, there isn't any competence there yet, there isn't any learning outcome. This is just that you're ready to start. Then in each of them, there's a learning pathway. In the knowledge domain, which is the one that is most commonly used and was certainly best developed by Bloom, then what we've got is going, first of all, that you remember something, then that you understand it, then you can apply it, then you can use it to analyze things, then you can use it to evaluate things, and lastly, you can actually create something that's original, new, and beyond what you've already learned. And a very similar sort of process with the skills, that the first level of awareness I like to think of as conscious incompetence, where you know that you don't know how to do it. And you'll see that at level S5 you move through to unconscious competence, which is where you do it so smoothly that you don't need to think about it any longer. Ah, we've got a different sound effect here. If you think of driving a car, just as an example, if you can remember back to when you first started, and being English, I'm talking about a car with gears, then what you have to do is terribly consciously steer and put your foot on the clutch and make sure you don't put it on the brake and then put it into neutral and into the next gear, etc., etc. And it's done very, very consciously, and that's probably at the level of S2 attempting. But before you do that, you have to understand what you're going to try and do, which is the level of readiness. And then driving around the car park, you get a sort of basic proficiency. You're thinking like mad about it. You can do it reasonably reliably. Your dad or whoever will trust you to use his car but it's still very much around the car park. And then you get out with basic proficiency, you can go on the road, but it's far yet from being unconscious competence. You pass your test probably with expert proficiency, maybe with just basic proficiency, but now you don't actually think about it. You're talking to somebody, you're listening to the radio, and it all just happens automatically. It has become unconscious competence. And I think the car driving metaphor probably doesn't work with creative proficiency. Perhaps better not to. On the attitudes domain, alertness is, again, just being aware that there are values and attitude things that you have to be aware of there. A1 is where you know what the right answer is and you do it, irrespective of whether you are committed to it in any way. You do what you're told. And at school, there's an awful lot of A1 around, isn't there? A2 is where you begin to have your own views on what things should be and the relative values of things, and that has no implication of actually having thought about it very much. It's just you're not just taking your attitudes and values from somebody else, they're your own, but they're probably not very consistent. So in the A3 level, you're actually thinking about it enough that you make them consistent. And then the A4 is where you actually not only make them consistent, but you actually believe them sufficiently strongly, you try jolly hard to comply with them and to set a good example. Now, fortunately, you should all have access to this, because I'd imagine it's completely impossible to read it on the screen. So I've passed around the coloured sheets, and that's got them all written out, and it gives much greater description about each of them, and you've got them for the three domains, the knowledge, the skills. I should mention, by the way, that the skills domain, my reading of Bloom is that he originally intended it to be for physical skills. I think psychomotor is all about hand and eye coordination. And yet I think skills domain should be interpreted now in terms of mental skills as well. Skills like using a spreadsheet or carrying out a particular paradigm when you're designing something. I think those are skills as well. And I think those fall under exactly the same stages of learning and of developing proficiency. So I'm not going to read all that out to you. That's your job. But what I am going to do is suggest that we have a buzz group at this stage, whereby each of you turns to your neighbour so that you're all in pairs. Make sure that between the two of you, you have at least one copy of the multicoloured sheet. And if you could first of all agree between yourselves about some learning outcome, preferably a competence, that you can both have some agreement on, and then work out what would be a suitable Bloom taxonomic level for a course to learn that. So, for example, you could have driving a car, but that would be very uncreative and unimaginative. So what I'd like you to do now is find your partner and agree the competence that you're going to discuss a learning outcome for, and then agree between you, and the idea is that you'll begin to see what's on those sheets and read them and understand them. Okay, I'm going to shut up. Over to you. I'm going to try and draw you to a halt if I possibly can. You're not meant to come here to enjoy yourself, you realise. You're meant to have been coming here to work. So I was expecting everybody would start looking surly at about this stage, because they'd done their job. Okay. I hope you don't mind me stopping you at this point, but I hope you've had a chance to look through, find out what the intention is within it, and find out some of the issues around it. No, go back one. What I'd like to do is to stop now for a moment so that you can ask questions, make points, leave the room, all that sort of thing. Okay, the floor is yours. Nava. Okay. If I could just add a quick response to that. Going back to the driving lessons and learning to drive, my mental model is that in many countries, and I don't know about Canada, and it probably changes from jurisdiction to jurisdiction, but you have, first of all, a theory test, which you have to do, and that very definitely is knowledge. And you do it with a paper and pencil or touch screen or something like that. Secondly, you drive around a car park between the slalom poles and you're developing the skills. And that's definitely skills. You're learning how to coordinate the feet and the hands and the steering wheel and all the rest of it. And then they unleash you on the traffic. And that's when you have to develop the knowledge, the skills, the attitudes, all combined together to make a full competence. So for me, full competence is all three of those things together. You can't do, in almost every case, you can't do the skills bit without having the knowledge, which is why you have to do the theory test first. But at the same time, it is different, and it's not. Well, in driving, it pretty much is just manual dexterity. But in many of the things that we do, it's not just manual dexterity. It's actually going through something like designing something. You go through a paradigm of some sort. So, yes, I agree. But I think of competence as being the full thing that brings together the skills, the knowledge, and the attitudes. Yes?
Our experience was very useful, but we shared the preoccupation of the lady because our competence was analyzing a scientific article, and we have some problem to locate the good level in the skill domain box, because we thought it was more in terms of physical dexterity than in mental dexterity.
Right, yeah. Any other comments, questions, please?
We could see how you needed all three domains in our outcome, and ours was very simple: plan a trip to a specific destination. We saw that they would have to have the basic knowledge, whatever, travel agent knowledge. The skill, and we took your note that it was mental as well, and so able to use the search engines and to uncover information through using technology. And then the attitude that in this case would be the customer service side, that the attitudes toward their customers and their sensitivity to, don't go to Calgary to get to Rome.
Yeah, even though you get a bigger cut on it. Yes. Okay. Does anybody else want to? Yes.
You seem to see a linear, first this, then this, then this. A lot of us crash and burn learners, experiential learners, start at the other end and then try to analyze where it went wrong and come up with the knowledge eventually.
I think there's truth in that. At the same time, the fact that Bloom has hung around for so long implies that it's actually quite helpful to think of that process. Well, I know that, for example, I'm completely unaware of when I started learning about how to relate to people and interpersonal skills. And I'm not aware of having been through any of those stages, and I see people who are already clearly accomplished, and they're completely unable to tell me how they went through those stages. Maybe they didn't visibly. So even if you don't have to pass through the stages, it's still, I think, quite useful to be able to specify the different levels, because in a learning outcome, then to say that this is the level we want to get to, it's very important. So I agree with you that in experiential learning, it's not always clear that people pass through them all sequentially. In many cases they do, but even if they don't, then it's still useful to have the different stages specified as a...
PLIR, we want to know where the gaps are.
Yep.
So this is still a useful...
Yes.
We also
And
saw it as something that could almost be cyclical, because you're doing the knowledge, the skills, the attitudes, but then something new comes along and you know, you could actually go through the new knowledge, oh, you're learning all about that and developing the skill, and then it becomes part of what you do. So although it's linear in fashion, it is important to use those pieces and the information in each of those blocks. It doesn't stop.
Yes.
That's what we're getting at.
Yeah. No, I absolutely agree. I'm going to move on, if that's all right. With any luck, there'll be time for more questions at the end. I got other things I want to tell you about. We did some testing in the project using the 3 qualifications for events management, and the events manager standard had 48 sub-skills, event coordinator 61, and then the most recent, the international event management standards, was 145. And so what we did was looked at, for each of those sub-skills, we allocated an appropriate new bloom level. And now I'm going to show you how that looked, taking the 3 different qualifications. So for the knowledge domain, you can see that it's probably too small to see, but the light blue is the IEMS, and that was very definitely majoring at level 5. I have to remind myself what level 5 is. It's evaluating. You can see that all of them were more or less there, but that the blue one, which was event manager, had about equal numbers in level 5 and level 6. If I move on to the next one, and of course they had virtually none at level 1 or level 2. Level 1 had nothing, which was just remembering things. Level 2 was just understanding them, but not actually doing anything with them. So there was, I think, one of each in level 2. Level 3, applying, you began to get some things, but it was really the analysing, evaluating, and creating. And so there were quite a few at level 6 in these event manager standards that required you to actually be creative, to develop new things. When we moved on to the skills domain, then the level 3 skills domain is about basic proficiency. And if you have a look in your text for basic proficiency, I don't have a copy of that any longer, so I can't read it. But we could perhaps go back to it. Anyway, could you read out basic proficiency? Okay, I'll do it. Thanks. Learned responses have become habitual, and the movements can be performed with some confidence, precision, and proficiency. Few errors are apparent. Conscious competence. So that was what we reckoned that a course aimed at somebody being shown to be a competent events manager, that was what we reckoned actually virtually all, well, I think all of the competencies of the sub-skills needed to be at that level. Now, interestingly, I'll show you another picture in a moment where a group of practitioners rated it, and they had a much greater variety. So this perhaps reflects the fact that I'm not a very good events manager. The last was the attitudes domain, and on the attitudes, the complying, you can see that both the international events manager and the events coordinator had quite a lot at level 1, but there was none from the events manager itself. Level 2, which was valuing, where you attach values and express personal opinions, you decide the worth and relevance of ideas and experiences, but you look at them as isolated and independent instances. You accept or adopt a particular stance, or you demonstrate attitudes which, although they're constant, they're not necessarily consistent between them. They're not necessarily consistent with each other. So that level 2, as far as we could see, there was only one case where a standard seemed to be require competence at that level. And then a lot of them at level 3, which was being able to consciously relate things. But there were some things at level 4 where you had to show commitment, and those were mostly relating to being a mentor or a role model. And I think you'd agree that being a role model, you need to actually demonstrate commitment rather than just be consistent. This is another way of portraying it, which was done by Phil Mondor from the CTHRC, which I thought was rather helpful. And I don't think he's in the room, is he? So you can perhaps correct me when I'm wrong, Eva. But as I understand it, he had a workshop of people who teach events managers, and he asked them what levels, using the Bloom taxonomy, the new Bloom, asked them what levels they thought the different standards should be. So we've listed the names of the standards at the bottom, and you can see them, 301 going on, 401, 501. And the top group is the knowledge, and the lower one, he's called performance. I'm not completely happy with calling it performance. I prefer to call it skills. The reason for that is that I think performance very definitely includes knowledge, whereas I think skills is slightly more separated out, and so I'd prefer to keep them slightly more separated. But it's perhaps something that some of the academics could try and worry away at a bit more, please. But I thought that was a very helpful way of demonstrating it. And what I was delighted to see was that the performances were no longer all at level P4. Well, S4, as I've labelled them. And also, just as a matter of interest, at the top you'll see the little symbols which are... Hold on. Get the right terms for all this. They're context ratings. So the first context rating up there is for the years taken to master it. The second one, which is the sort of going round and round, is about the frequency of things that happen, and RR means routinely and regularly, and they had a couple of other levels that it could be, PP per project, and occasionally or daily. So that's a second thing. And then the last one is importance or criticality. And as far as I can see, that's on a scale from 1 to 5. So I just thought that was interesting as a way of presenting it, and helpful. And next want to talk a little bit about the Bloom levels related to qualification framework levels. So does everybody here have some idea about qualification framework levels? All those who have a good idea about qualification frameworks, could you raise your hand? Okay, I'll explain. Qualification frameworks are something that we've been developing in Europe, and you're developing certainly in the tourism sector. I'm not sure how much further beyond in Canada. And the idea is that different qualifications, different courses are at different levels of intellectual challenge. And in Europe, we've developed something called the European Qualification Framework, and I will be saying rather more about this on Tuesday, tomorrow, in my section on RPL in Europe. But we've agreed on 8 levels, and just as an idea, level 8, we reckon, is doctorate and above. Level 7 is master's degree and above. Level 6 is bachelor honours degree and above. And then the other levels go down from that. And so the qualifications framework level reflects the intellectual challenge. And I think you can see that that's reasonably consistent. The qualification framework level for a particular unit of, let's say, an occupational profile or an occupational standard, a competency profile, or for a qualification, or for an occupation as a whole, you can use a qualification framework level for that. So that, for example, as a chartered engineer, then I would reckon that my qualification was at level 7, because in order to achieve a chartered engineer, I have to at least have got a master's degree in engineering. And in fact, as one gets more experience and one becomes more specialized, perhaps one becomes level 8, because one is moving up to the sort of equivalent of doctorate studies. But as an engineer, one doesn't do them, one builds things. The Bloom level, by comparison, reflects the stage of learning or the degree of proficiency. And so you can pass through those stages for things that are at different qualification framework levels. When I'm learning to do the stress in a beam, maybe it's at level 5. If I'm dealing with Schrödinger's wave equation, perhaps it's at level 7. But I still go through the same stages, through the same levels of proficiency in learning how to do it. And I become increasingly competent at doing it in terms of New Bloom. So the point I'm trying to make is that although there is progression in New Bloom as you get more proficient at doing things, and although there is progression in qualification frameworks as you move to more intellectually challenging things, so that you may get the two correlating, it doesn't necessarily mean that level 7 in a qualification framework must imply such and such a New Bloom level. You could be starting off at level 7 with Schrödinger's wave equation, or you could be starting off with level 2 with driving. Is that reasonably clear? And you will remember that the important thing about Bloom is that it implies what is the appropriate learning process. If you know that somebody is, or that your learning outcome is going to be attitudes and values level 4, then the sort of learning outcome you'll ask people to go through in order to achieve that is going to be completely different from one which is level 1 of complying. If you want them to be at the complying level, what they need to do is know what it is and know what you're going to do if they don't do it. Level 4, commitment, that's a completely different sort of learning process. And in the same way, if you want to assess whether they have achieved that level, it's again a completely different sort of testing process. For level 1, you need to make sure that they know what the problems are if they don't do it. And for level 4, you need to observe them and ask what their behavior has been like. Totally different. There are many transferable skills, many skills that you use in a lot of different occupations. And it's very important that you have the same standards for those transferable skills, rather than transport developing its supervision and management standards separately from tourism, separately from construction. Because if the construction world goes down and I have to go and get work in the transport sector, and they're using actually the same competencies, but they've expressed them differently in their qualifications, it's terribly difficult to get it recognized. And so the more that you can use standard definitions across the whole of Canada, I think it's going to save you an awful lot of work in the future. So this is Nigel Lloyd banging his drum. I also think that it would make an awful lot of sense to have a single Canadian national qualification framework rather than separate ones in each sector. Well, I'm glad I'm putting... I was worried I might get eggs and brickbats coming at this point. And the national qualification framework it needs to cover not only the academic qualifications, and that implies school ones as well as higher ones, but also vocational and professional. It doesn't do you any good keeping them all in separate pots. And I suppose coming from outside, since I like simplicity, it'd be much more helpful if yours related nice and easily to international ones as well, please. And I commend to you the European Qualifications Framework. Okay, that was all that I wanted to say. Are there any other questions or comments? Or have we run out of time? Let's have a few questions and comments. Well, while you're thinking of your questions and comments, you will be aware that there is a session later on today by Yves Baudin, who is hiding in front of a pillar over there. And I'm actually partially here because Yves has just employed me to work on the Seasick project, and he's going to be talking in the session, with me making the odd squeak as well, about the whole issue of how foreign credentials and foreign credential assessment relates to PILAR. Do you want to say any more than that, Yves?
It's just that it's a section on academic credential evaluation. And the contract that we have just finalized with Nigel is obviously going to have a component in there relating to prior learning, because we think this is important. And so it's a national project which involves ARUP, the registrars of universities and colleges, sector councils, apprenticeship, regulatory bodies, as well as credential evaluation services. And Mr. Bloom has told us that he would try to put those competencies, because we're going to be developing a competency profile of a academic credential evaluator. Mr. Bloom is going to include in there the new Bloom dimensions of it, which should be interesting. We're really looking forward to the final product. And this competency profile is going to lead into a probably university program for academic credential evaluators, so that we professionalize the occupation, and that also will be interesting in time to see how it fits into the Canadian standards and procedures, which are not necessarily, and we'll educate Mr. Nigel, not necessarily the European qualification framework, even though we think it's a great framework. We think that we can do things here also, which are great. So this afternoon at 4 o'clock, 4:15, I think it's in Albert Room. Please come and help Mr. Bloom understand the qualifications in Canada, and more importantly, the input that you can have for the competencies that we will be developing, that you will all benefit from over the next little while.
Thank you very much.